The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 2 days after the worst blizzard Vermont had seen in 30 years, and I knew immediately it was going to ruin my week. I stood in my driveway, coffee in one hand and the thick envelope in the other, watching steam rise from my mug into the frigid February air. My name, Carter Whitmore, was printed in officious block letters across the front, along with an address for something called the Pinewood Ridge Homeowners Association. I didn't recognize the name, which should have been my first clue that something was off. I'd lived in Burlington for 15 years, inherited my grandfather's property out in the hills about 3 miles from the city limits, and I'd never once heard of any HOA in the area. The letter inside was 3 pages of dense legal jargon, but the essence was clear enough. According to the Pinewood Ridge HOA, specifically their president, a woman named Barbara Hartwell, I was in violation of multiple community covenants for failing to clear snow from the roads serving their neighborhood. They were demanding I remedy the situation within 48 hours or face legal action, including fines of up to $5,000 per day and a lien against my property. I read it twice, standing there in the cold, my coffee going lukewarm in my hand. Then I went inside, fired up my computer, and started pulling files from the cabinet in my home office. My grandfather had been meticulous about documentation, and when he'd passed 5 years ago, I'd inherited not just his house but an entire filing system that detailed every inch of property he owned in the area. What I found made me laugh out loud. Then I called my lawyer. "Tom," I said when he picked up, "you remember those old property deeds my grandfather left me, the ones for that road he built back in the 70s? Tom Richardson had been my family's attorney for decades. He'd handled my grandfather's estate personally. I remember. Pinewood Trail, right? Private road serving about 8 properties. Your grandfather maintained it for years as a courtesy, even though he had no legal obligation to do so. Why? Because apparently someone built a neighborhood up there, formed an HOA, and they just sent me a legal threat demanding I plow their roads." There was a pause. They did what? I'm looking at a certified letter right now, 3 pages. They're claiming I'm in violation of community covenants and threatening to fine me $5,000 a day. Tom started laughing. It was a deep, rumbling sound that made me grin despite my annoyance. "Carter, please tell me you're thinking what I think you're thinking. I'm thinking I'd like to have a conversation with this Barbara Hartwell about property rights and private road ownership, but I want to make sure I'm on solid legal ground first." "Oh, you're on solid ground. You're on bedrock. Your grandfather you own that entire roadway. It's private property properly recorded with the county. If they built a development up there, they should have done their due diligence. That road was never deeded to the county, never made public. It's yours. So they have no right to demand anything from me. None whatsoever. In fact, they're technically trespassing every time they use it. Your grandfather granted informal permission, but that was a personal courtesy, not a legal easement. You could revoke that permission tomorrow if you wanted." I thought about that for a moment, looking out my window at the snow-covered street. "I'm not trying to be vindictive, Tom, but I don't appreciate being threatened." "Understandable. Want me to draft a response?" "Let me talk to them first. If that doesn't work out, I'll need you to go nuclear." "Looking forward to it," Tom said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. The letter included a phone number for the HOA office, which turned out to be Barbara Hartwell's home number. I waited until after lunch to call, wanting to give myself time to cool down and approach this rationally. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, sharp and impatient. "Hartwell Residence. Mrs. Hartwell, this is Carter Whitmore. I received a letter from you today regarding snow removal." "Oh yes, Mr. Whitmore." Her tone shifted, becoming even more condescending. "I'm glad you're taking this seriously. The roads are still completely impassable, and several of our residents have been unable to get to work. This is absolutely unacceptable." "I see. Can I ask you something? What makes you think I'm responsible for clearing those roads?" "Because you're the property owner adjacent to our community, and according to our research at the county clerk's office, the roads were built by a Walter Whitmore back in 1973. I assume that's your father, grandfather. Well, then you're obviously responsible for maintaining them. We have 18 families in Pinewood Ridge who pay substantial property taxes, and we expect basic services like snow removal, especially after a blizzard like we just had." I rubbed my forehead, feeling a headache starting. "Mrs. Hartwell, did your research at the county clerk's office happen to include looking up who actually owns those roads?" "They're public roads, Mr. Whitmore. Don't try to wriggle out of your responsibilities." "They're not public roads. They're private roads. I own them. My grandfather built Pinewood Trail and the two side streets that branch off it, all on his own property, and maintained them as a courtesy to the few neighbors who lived up there at the time. But they were never deeded to the town or county. They're mine." There was a long silence. "Then, that's absurd. You can't own a road." "Actually, I can and I do. I have the original deeds, the survey maps, and the property tax records to prove it. You're welcome to verify this with the county if you'd like." "This is ridiculous." Her voice was rising now, taking on that particular quality I'd come to recognize over the years. It was the sound of someone who was used to getting their way and didn't handle contradiction well. "Those roads serve an entire community. You have a responsibility to maintain them." "I have no such responsibility. My grandfather chose to maintain them out of goodwill, but he had no legal obligation to do so, and neither do I. What I do have is a problem with receiving threatening legal letters when I've done nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong." "Mr. Whitmore, we have elderly residents who haven't been able to get their medication. We have people who have missed work. One of our families has a child with asthma who needs regular doctor visits. Your negligence is affecting real people's lives." "My negligence." I felt my temper starting to fray. "Mrs. Hartwell, I didn't force anyone to buy a house in your development. I didn't tell your builder to construct homes accessed by a private road. And I certainly didn't send the blizzard. None of this is my responsibility." "We'll see what a judge has to say about that. You'll be hearing from our attorney." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding the phone, anger and disbelief warring in my chest. Then I called Tom back. "She threatened to sue me," I said without preamble. "Then we respond in kind. Give me an hour. I'm going to draft something that will make their lawyer very nervous." True to his word, Tom emailed me a draft letter within the hour. It was beautiful in its precision. It outlined my legal ownership of the roads, cited the relevant property laws, noted that the HOA and its residents were technically trespassing on my private property, and suggested that any further threats or harassment would result in me pursuing legal action for damages. It concluded by noting that I was generously continuing to allow residents access to their homes via my private road, but that this access was a revocable privilege, not a right. "You don't really want to cut off their access, do you?" Tom asked when I called him after reading it. "No," I admitted. "That would hurt people who probably had nothing to do with this letter. But I want this Barbara Hartwell to understand the situation she's actually in before she escalates further. This should do it. Want me to send it certified, return receipt requested, please? And Tom, start pulling together everything we'd need if they actually do sue. I want to be ready, already on it." The next 2 days were quiet. I went about my normal routine, working from home on the software consulting projects that paid my bills, shoveling my own driveway, and trying not to think about the situation too much. The roads in town were mostly cleared, though side streets were still a mess. Out where my grandfather's old property was, I knew the situation was probably worse. The main highway would be clear, but the private roads leading to individual properties would be the owner's responsibility to clear. On Friday, I got Tom's call. Their lawyer contacted me, he said. Fellow named Dennis Pritchard. He was very apologetic. Very. Apparently Mrs. Hartwell didn't consult him before sending you that threatening letter. He did his own research after she told him to file suit, discovered the situation with the road ownership, and immediately called to smooth things over. He's trying to prevent a lawsuit, not file one. Smart man. He did ask if you'd be willing to meet with the HOA board to discuss the situation. He seemed to think there might be room for some kind of arrangement. I considered that. What kind of arrangement? He didn't specify. I got the impression he was hoping you'd be open to working something out rather than pulling access entirely. I never wanted to pull access. I just want them to stop threatening me. Then maybe a meeting would be worthwhile. Show good faith, establish boundaries, see if there's a reasonable solution. Set it up, I said, but I want you there. Wouldn't miss it. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at Barbara Hartwell's house, which apparently doubled as the unofficial HOA headquarters. Tom and I drove out together, taking the winding highway into the hills and then turning onto Pinewood Trail. I'd been out this way a few times since my grandfather died, but not recently, and I was curious to see what had changed. The old road was in rough shape after the blizzard. Someone had made an attempt to plow it, probably one of the residents with a pickup truck and a blade, but it was still rutted and icy. We passed my grandfather's original property, a modest cabin that I rented out to a young couple who loved the isolation, and continued up the hill. After about a quarter-mile, the road forked, and that's where the new development began. Pinewood Ridge was one of those manufactured communities that had sprung up during the housing boom, a collection of large houses on small lots, all built in the same 3 or 4 styles with minor variations. They looked expensive and somewhat out of place in the rural Vermont landscape, like someone had airlifted a suburban neighborhood from Connecticut and dropped it in the middle of the woods. There were 2 streets, Pine Court and Ridge Avenue, each with 9 houses arranged in neat rows. Barbara Hartwell's house was at the end of Ridge Avenue, a large colonial with a 3-car garage and elaborate landscaping buried under snow. Lights blazed from every window, and I counted 4 other cars in the driveway when we pulled up. "Ready?" Tom asked. "Let's get this over with." Barbara Hartwell answered the door herself. She was exactly what I'd pictured, mid-50s, blonde hair in a severe bob, wearing a cream-colored sweater set and enough jewelry to open a small boutique. Her smile was tight and didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Richardson. Please come in." The house was aggressively decorated in what I thought of as corporate hotel style, everything expensive, nothing personal. We were led to a formal dining room where 4 other people sat around a large table. Barbara introduced them as the HOA board. Michael Stern, treasurer, Patricia Chen, secretary, Donald Yarborough, vice president, and Dennis Pritchard, the attorney, who was technically not a board member but was present in an advisory capacity. We all shook hands and sat down. Someone had prepared coffee and cookies, which sat untouched in the middle of the table. The atmosphere was tense. Barbara opened the meeting with what I assumed was her standard speech. "Thank you all for coming. We're here to discuss the unfortunate situation regarding road maintenance in Pinewood Ridge and to hopefully come to an amicable solution. Before we start, Tom said smoothly, I want to make sure we're all operating from the same set of facts. Mrs. Hartwell, have you verified the information I included in my letter regarding property ownership? She pursed her lips. Yes, Dennis confirmed that the roads are technically private property. Not technically, Tom corrected. Actually, they're private roads on private land owned by my client. Fine. Actually private. The point is we need to find a solution. We have a community here, families, and we need reliable access to our homes. I agree, I said, speaking for the first time. Nobody's talking about cutting off access, but I need everyone here to understand something. I didn't ask for this situation. I inherited these roads from my grandfather, who built them 50 years ago to access his own property. He maintained them as a favor to a handful of neighbors. But when your developer built this community, they should have done their homework. They should have either purchased the roads from my grandfather or arranged a formal easement. They didn't do that. The developer is bankrupt, Michael Stern said. He was a thin man with nervous hands that kept fidgeting with his pen. They went under in 2009. We've tried to track them down for other issues, but the company doesn't exist anymore and the principals have scattered. That's unfortunate, Tom said, but it doesn't change the legal reality. The roads are Mr. Whitmore's property. So what do you want? Barbara asked bluntly. Money. Are you here to shake us down? I felt my jaw clench. I'm here because you sent me a threatening letter demanding I provide you with services I have no obligation to provide. I'm here because instead of asking nicely, you tried to bully me with legal threats. What I want is an apology and an acknowledgement that you were wrong. I'm not apologizing for trying to protect our community. Barbara, Dennis Pritchard said softly, maybe we should focus on moving forward rather than rehashing the past. She glared at him but said nothing. Patricia Chen, who'd been silent until now, cleared her throat. Mr. Whitmore, I think what we're all wondering is what happens now. Are you planning to continue allowing us access to the roads? And if so, what are the terms? I looked at Tom, who gave me a small nod. We discussed this scenario. Here's what I'm willing to do. I'll grant you a formal easement for access to your properties. It'll be recorded with the county, so you'll have legal certainty. In exchange, you'll be responsible for all maintenance, repair, and snow removal on the roads. I'll require proof of liability insurance covering the roads, and you'll indemnify me against any claims arising from your use of them. That sounds reasonable, Patricia said. It sounds expensive, Barbara snapped. Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain a road? Or to plow it after a storm like we just had? I don't actually, I said, because I've never claimed to be responsible for these roads. But since you've built a community that depends on them, I'd suggest you figure it out. We could assess the residents, Michael suggested. Special assessment for road maintenance. Split the costs evenly. That's going to be thousands of dollars per household, Barbara said. Then you should have thought of that before you bought a house on a private road, I replied. The meeting went downhill from there. Barbara wanted me to either deed the roads to the HOA outright or agree to maintain them myself in exchange for some nominal fee. I refused both options. Tom explained multiple times that I had no obligation to do anything, that I was being generous by offering an easement at all, and that the alternative was me potentially closing the roads entirely. You can't do that, Barbara shouted at one point. That's extortion. It's property rights, Tom said calmly. And if you continue to make accusations like that, we'll end this meeting and you can deal with the consequences. Dennis Pritchard finally managed to broker a cooling-off period. We agreed to adjourn for 2 weeks to let everyone consider options. Tom would draft a formal easement agreement, and the HOA board would consult with their members about funding for road maintenance. Nobody was happy, but at least we'd established a framework for negotiation. As Tom and I were leaving, Patricia Chen caught up with us at the door. "Mr. Whitmore, I just want to apologize for how this started. That letter Barbara sent you was out of line. Some of us didn't know about it until after she'd sent it." "I appreciate that," I said. "Most of us are reasonable people. We just want to make sure we can get to our homes safely. We're willing to pay for that. That's all I'm asking. Barbara is going to be a problem, though. She doesn't like being told no." I glanced back toward the dining room where I could hear Barbara's voice rising in argument with someone. I got that impression. Over the next 2 weeks, Tom worked on the easement agreement while I tried to get back to normal life. But Barbara Hartwell wasn't done. She started a campaign, both online and in person, painting me as a greedy opportunist trying to exploit her community. She posted in local Facebook groups, wrote letters to the editor of the Burlington Free Press, and even tried to get the town council involved. The social media posts were particularly nasty. She never used my name, but the details made it obvious who she was talking about. According to her version of events, I was a slumlord trying to extort innocent families, preventing elderly residents from accessing medical care, and endangering children by refusing to clear snow from public roads. The comments sections filled up with people who knew nothing about the situation, but were happy to share their outrage. Some of my actual neighbors came to my defense, and Tom sent Barbara a cease and desist letter threatening action for defamation, but the damage was done. I started getting nasty looks at the grocery store, and one of my consulting clients called to ask if there were any issues they should know about. The situation came to a head 3 weeks after the initial meeting. I was working in my home office when I heard vehicles outside. Looking out the window, I saw a pickup truck with a plow blade turning into my driveway. Behind it were 2 more trucks and a handful of cars. I went outside to find Barbara Hartwell climbing out of one of the cars, along with a dozen other people I assumed were Pinewood Ridge residents. The lead truck had started pushing snow from my driveway into a massive pile blocking my garage. "What are you doing?" I called out. Barbara turned to me with a triumphant smile. "We're showing you what it feels like to have your access blocked. How do you like it? You're trespassing. Get off my property. We'll leave when you agree to be reasonable about the roads." The truck finished blocking my garage and started backing out. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "I'd like to report trespassing and property damage," I said when the dispatcher answered. I gave her my address and a description of what was happening. Barbara's smile faded. "You're calling the cops? Seriously? You just blocked my driveway and damaged my property. What did you think would happen? It's just snow, we'll move it. After you used it to try to intimidate me." "Yeah, I'm calling the cops." The crowd started to look nervous. Several people drifted back toward their vehicles. Barbara stood her ground, but I could see uncertainty creeping into her expression. The county sheriff's deputy arrived 15 minutes later. His name tag read Wilson, and he had the patient, slightly weary expression of someone who dealt with his share of neighbor disputes. He listened to both sides of the story, looked at the massive pile of snow blocking my garage, and shook his head. "Madam, this is pretty clearly trespassing. And if he wants to press charges for property damage, he's got grounds." "Property damage? It's snow. Snow you deliberately piled on his property to block his access. That's vandalism at minimum, possibly criminal mischief depending on how the DA wants to look at it." "This is insane," Barbara said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "He's the one who's been harassing our community." Deputy Wilson turned to me. "Do you want to press charges?" I looked at Barbara, at the crowd of residents who'd come with her, at the enormous pile of snow that was going to take me hours to clear. I was angry, but I was also tired. This whole situation had spiraled so far beyond what it needed to be. "I want my driveway cleared," I said. "All of it. Back to exactly how it was. If they do that, and if Mrs. Hartwell agrees to stop the harassment campaign, I'll let this go. But if anything like this happens again, I'm pressing charges immediately." Deputy Wilson looked at Barbara. "That seems fair." "Fine," she spat. "We'll clear your precious driveway." It took them almost 2 hours, using the same plows that had created the mess in the first place. Deputy Wilson stayed the entire time, making sure they did a thorough job. When they were finally done and the crowd had dispersed, he came over to where I was standing on my front porch. "You want some advice?" he asked. "Sure. Document everything. Take pictures, keep records of every interaction. I've seen disputes like this before, and they tend to escalate. If you've got proof of harassment or trespassing, it makes our job a lot easier." "Already doing it," I said. "Thanks for coming out." "That's what we're here for. And for what it's worth, I looked up the property records while I was waiting. You're in the right here." But sometimes being right isn't enough to avoid trouble. He drove away, leaving me alone with my cleared driveway and the sinking feeling that this wasn't over. I was right. 2 days later, the county road commissioner showed up at my door. His name was Frank Morrison, a heavy-set man in his 60s who'd held the position for as long as I could remember. "Carter," he said when I opened the door. "Got time to talk?" "About what?" "About those roads out in Pinewood Ridge. I've been getting calls." I invited him in and made coffee while he explained the situation. Barbara Hartwell had gone to the county, claiming that the roads in her development were public and demanding that the county take over their maintenance. When the county had explained that the roads were private property, she'd shifted tactics and asked if the county could force me to deed them to the public trust. "Can they do that?" I asked. "Not without your consent or a damn good legal reason, which we don't have." "But Barbara's making noise about bringing it before the select board, and I wanted to give you a heads up." "I appreciate that." Frank sipped his coffee. "Your grandfather was a good man. He understood that sometimes being neighborly means doing more than you're legally required to do. But he also knew when to stand firm. I'm not telling you what to do here, Carter, but I will say this. If you force the county to get involved officially, it's going to create a lot of paperwork and headaches for everyone. I'm not forcing anything. I offered them an easement. All I asked was that they maintain the roads themselves. That's reasonable. But reasonable and easy aren't always the same thing." He set down his mug and stood. "I'll do what I can to keep the county out of it, but you might want to think about whether there's a compromise you can live with." After he left, I called Tom and filled him in on the latest developments. "She's not going to stop," Tom said. "She's one of those people who sees compromise as weakness. She's going to keep pushing until she gets what she wants or gets slapped down hard enough to make her stop." "So what do I do?" "You stand firm. We've got the easement agreement ready to go. If they won't sign it, that's their problem. And if Barbara keeps up the harassment, we sue her personally for defamation and get a restraining order." "I don't want to sue anyone. I just want this to be over." "I know. But sometimes you don't get that choice." The select board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in March. Tom advised me to attend, just to show presence and make sure nothing happened without my knowledge. The meeting was held in the town hall, a converted church building in the center of Burlington that smelled of old wood and furniture polish. The room was more crowded than I'd expected. The entire Pinewood Ridge contingent was there, at least 30 people, wearing matching green T-shirts that said, keep our community safe. They'd organized, which was either impressive or terrifying depending on your perspective. Barbara presented their case to the 5 select board members. She'd prepared a slideshow, complete with photos of the snowy roads, heartfelt testimonials from residents about hardships caused by poor road maintenance, and a proposal for the town to use eminent domain to take over the roads for the public good. It was actually a compelling presentation, if you didn't know the full context. Several board members looked sympathetic until Tom asked for the opportunity to respond. He laid out the facts methodically. The roads were private property, had always been private property, and were properly maintained by my grandfather for decades as a courtesy. The development company had failed to do its due diligence, and the current situation was not my fault or responsibility. He noted that I'd offered a generous easement requiring only that the residents maintain their own roads, and that this offer had been rejected. He concluded by noting that any attempt to use eminent domain for this purpose would be a gross abuse of government power and would result in immediate legal action. The board deliberated for about 10 minutes before the chairwoman, a sharp-eyed woman named Helen Courtney, delivered their decision. While we sympathize with the residents of Pinewood Ridge, the town cannot and will not attempt to seize private property without clear public necessity. The roads in question serve a single private development, and Mr. Whitmore has offered a reasonable solution. The town's recommendation is that the Pinewood Ridge HOA accept the proposed easement and work with Mr. Whitmore in good faith. Barbara stood up, her face red. "This is outrageous. You're abandoning your constituents." "We're following the law," Helen said calmly. "I understand you're frustrated, but this is not a matter the town can or should intervene in." The meeting moved on to other business, but the Pinewood Ridge contingent filed out, many of them shooting angry looks in my direction. I stayed for the rest of the meeting, partly out of principle and partly because I wanted to thank Helen afterwards. That was never going to go her way, Helen told me as we stood in the parking lot. But between you and me, you might want to find a way to resolve this. Barbara's got a lot of time on her hands and a talent for making noise. She's going to keep pushing. I don't know what else to offer. I've been more than fair. Fair doesn't always win the day, though, just something to think about. I drove home through the dark, winding roads, thinking about everything that had happened. This whole situation had started with a blizzard and a threatening letter, and now it had consumed hours of my time, cost me money in legal fees, and turned into a community controversy. All because Barbara Hartwell couldn't accept that she didn't have the right to demand things from me. The next escalation came from a direction I didn't expect. I received a call from one of my renters, the young couple living in my grandfather's old cabin at the start of Pinewood Trail. "Carter, we need to talk," said Jeremy, the husband. "We've been having some problems." "What kind of problems?" "Harassment, I think. Someone's been leaving notes on our door. And yesterday, someone blocked our driveway with a bunch of tree branches." My stomach dropped. "What did the notes say?" "Things about us being associated with you, about how we're part of the problem. It's really uncomfortable. Jenny's actually scared to be here alone now." I drove out that afternoon to see them. The couple met me outside the cabin, both looking nervous. Jeremy showed me photos of the notes, which were typed and unsigned. They weren't explicitly threatening, but they were definitely meant to intimidate, full of implications about consequences and community action. "I'm so sorry," I said. "This is about the dispute with the HOA up the road." "Someone's trying to get at me through you. We kind of figured," Jenny said. "But Carter, we can't live like this. We love this place, but not if we're going to be harassed. Give me a week to sort this out. If I can't fix it, I'll let you out of your lease, no penalty." They agreed, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. I didn't blame them. I called Deputy Wilson and reported the harassment. He came out, took photos of the notes, and promised to increase patrols in the area. But we all knew that without catching someone in the act, there wasn't much he could do. Tom was furious when I told him, "This is over the line, way over. We need to go after them. We don't know it was them. We can't prove anything." "Come on, Carter, who else would it be?" He was right, of course, but proving it was another matter entirely. The proof came 3 days later in the form of a video. One of my renter's neighbors, an older man who lived about half a mile away, had installed trail cameras on his property after having issues with poachers. One of his cameras had a view of the road, and it had captured footage of Barbara Hartwell's distinctive black Mercedes driving slowly past Jeremy and Jenny's cabin around midnight, stopping briefly, and then driving away. The timestamp matched when one of the notes had been left. The neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Harold, brought me the SD card himself. "Thought you might want to see this. I've heard about what's been going on up there, and I don't hold with that kind of behavior. Your grandfather was good people." I thanked Harold profusely and immediately called Tom, then Deputy Wilson. This was evidence of criminal harassment and possibly trespassing depending on whether Barbara had left her vehicle. Deputy Wilson came out to review the footage. "That's her car, and that's definitely her behind the wheel. Combined with the pattern of harassment and the notes, we've got enough for charges. Want to press them?" I thought about Jeremy and Jenny, scared in their own home. I thought about all the social media posts, the manufactured pile of snow, the constant attempts to intimidate and manipulate. I thought about Barbara's smug face at every confrontation. "Yes," I said, "I want to press charges." Barbara Hartwell was arrested the following week on charges of criminal harassment and stalking. The arrest was quiet, just Deputy Wilson showing up at her door with a warrant, but word spread through the community like wildfire. The local paper picked up the story, and suddenly the narrative shifted. Instead of a David versus Goliath story about residents fighting a greedy landowner, it became a story about an HOA president who'd crossed legal and ethical lines. The Pinewood Ridge community fractured. Some residents stood by Barbara, insisting she'd been fighting for their interests and had just gotten a little overzealous. But others, including Patricia Chen and Michael Stern, publicly distanced themselves from her actions. Patricia called me directly to apologize and to ask if we could restart negotiations. "Barbara's been removed as HOA president," she told me. "The board voted unanimously. I'm the interim president until we can hold elections. And I want you to know that most of us never wanted things to go this way. We just want a solution." "I'm still offering the same easement," I said, "but I need guarantees that the harassment stops, all of it. You have my word. And I'll make sure everyone in the community understands that any further problems will result in immediate consequences." Tom and Patricia's lawyer worked out the final easement agreement over the next 2 weeks. It was essentially what I'd offered from the beginning. A recorded easement granting the Pinewood Ridge residents permanent access to the roads, with the HOA responsible for all maintenance and repairs. The HOA carried liability insurance naming me as an additional insured party, and they agreed to indemnify me against any claims arising from the road's use or condition. The special assessment to fund road maintenance came out to $3,500 per household for the first year, which included clearing the remaining snow, repairing winter damage, and building up a reserve fund. There were complaints, but the alternative was having no legal access to their homes, so the assessment passed. Barbara's trial was set for June. Her lawyer tried to get the charges reduced to a misdemeanor, arguing that her actions were civil harassment rather than criminal stalking. Tom, acting as the prosecution's witness coordinator, pushed back hard. The case included not just the notes left at my renter's property, but also the deliberate blocking of my driveway, the defamation campaign, and a pattern of escalating behavior designed to intimidate and coerce. In the end, Barbara accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to criminal harassment, received a suspended sentence with 2 years of probation, and was ordered to pay restitution covering my legal fees and the damages from the driveway incident. She was also required to issue a formal, public apology and to have no contact with me or my tenants. The apology was posted on the Pinewood Ridge HOA's website and emailed to all residents. It was brief and clearly written by her lawyer, acknowledging that her actions had been inappropriate and illegal and expressing regret for the harm caused. It didn't feel particularly sincere, but I hadn't expected it to. What mattered was that she'd been held accountable. Life slowly returned to normal. Jeremy and Jenny decided to stay in the cabin, especially after I installed better security lighting and Deputy Wilson made good on his promise of regular patrols. The road easement was recorded with the county, giving all parties legal certainty. The Pinewood Ridge HOA hired a local contractor to handle snow removal and maintenance, and from what I heard, the roads were actually in better shape than they'd been in years. I ran into Patricia Chen at a farmer's market in Burlington one Saturday in August. She was friendly, thanking me again for working with them and updating me on the community. "We've got a new president now," she told me. "Donald Yarborough. He's very focused on just handling the basics and staying out of controversies. It's actually been quite peaceful." "That's good to hear. And I wanted you to know, several of us have been spreading the word to anyone thinking of moving into the community about the real story of what happened. We don't want people coming in with the wrong expectations or thinking they can make demands on you." I appreciate that. We learned a hard lesson about doing due diligence and understanding property rights. But honestly, it could have been much worse. You would have been within your rights to shut down access entirely. That would have hurt people who didn't do anything wrong. I didn't want that. Well, we're grateful anyway. I drove home that day feeling like maybe things had finally settled. The whole ordeal had taken 6 months from start to finish, consumed countless hours of my time, cost me several $1,000s even with the restitution, and caused more stress than I cared to remember. But it had also taught me something about standing firm when you're in the right, even when it's difficult and unpopular. My grandfather had built those roads 50 years ago, maintaining them out of generosity and good neighborliness. He'd never imagined that a development would spring up, or that his grandson would end up in a legal battle over property rights. But he'd also instilled in me a respect for the law and for proper documentation, which had made all the difference. Tom called me one evening in September as I was finishing up a project deadline. "Just wanted to let you know, Barbara's probation is going well apparently. No violations, she's keeping her head down." "That's good." "It is, and I wanted to thank you actually." "For what?" "For letting me handle that case. It was deeply satisfying from a legal perspective. Clear facts, good documentation, a client who was completely in the right. We don't get many of those," I laughed. "Happy to provide you with entertainment." It wasn't just entertainment. It was a reminder of why property rights matter and why we have laws. Barbara thought she could bully her way into getting what she wanted, but the system worked. The right outcome happened. Eventually counts. The following winter was mild, with only one significant snowfall in January. I watched the weather reports with interest, wondering if there would be any issues with clearing the Pinewood Ridge roads. But the HOA's contractor was apparently on top of it. The roads were cleared within 12 hours, with no drama and no complaints. I drove out to check on Jeremy and Jenny one afternoon after the snow had fallen. They were doing well, and Jeremy told me they'd signed a new lease for another year. "It's nice out here without all the tension," he said. And honestly, we like being part of the story. When people ask where we live and we explain, they're always interested. "Fame by association," I joked. Something like that. I continued down Pinewood Trail, past the fork where it split into Pine Court and Ridge Avenue, past the neat rows of houses in Pinewood Ridge. The roads were clear, the snow piled neatly on the sides. Everything looked peaceful and normal, like the whole conflict had never happened. At the end of Ridge Avenue, I could see Barbara Hartwell's house. Her distinctive Mercedes was in the driveway, and smoke rose from the chimney. I wondered what she thought about now, whether she'd learned anything from the experience or just resented being caught and punished. I'd never know, and I supposed it didn't matter. The roads had been the catalyst for the conflict, but the real issue had always been about power and respect. Barbara had thought she could force me to do what she wanted through intimidation and pressure. She'd been wrong, and the consequences had been severe. The community had learned a lesson about property rights and due diligence, and I'd learned something about the importance of standing firm, even when it would be easier to back down. As I drove back home, I thought about my grandfather and the roads he'd built. He'd done it to access his land and to help his neighbors. He couldn't have known how that simple act of construction would ripple forward through the years, creating both obligation and opportunity for his grandson. But he'd left me the tools to handle it. Clear documentation, proper legal structure, and a stubborn streak that knew when to fight for what was right. The property deeds were filed away safely in my office, along with the recorded easement, the court documents from Barbara's case, and a thick folder of correspondence documenting the entire 6-month saga. I hoped I'd never need any of it again, but I kept it organized and accessible, just in case. Life went on. Projects came in, deadlines were met, seasons changed. The roads remained private property, properly maintained by the people who used them. The system had worked the way it was supposed to, even though it had taken time and money and effort to get there. On a warm evening in April, almost a year after the original certified letter had arrived, I was sitting on my back porch watching the sunset when my phone rang. It was Harold, the neighbor who'd provided the trail camera footage. "Carter, wanted to give you a heads up. Someone from a development company came around asking about property in the area. They were particularly interested in land along Pinewood Trail. Thanks for letting me know. Did they say what they were planning? Another housing development, sounds like. Smaller than Pinewood Ridge, maybe 5 or 6 houses. They wanted to know who owned the road access." I smiled. "I hope you told them." I did. And I told them they'd better do their homework before they buy anything. Don't think the area can handle another situation like we had last year. Agreed. After I hung up, I thought about calling Tom to discuss what legal protections I might need if another development did go in. But then I decided it could wait. If someone wanted to build on private land accessed by my roads, they could come talk to me directly. And if they bothered to do proper due diligence, they'd know exactly who they needed to negotiate with before they broke ground. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in the hills, the roads that had caused so much trouble wound through the Vermont landscape, serving their purpose, maintained by the people who depended on them. Everything was as it should be, balanced and proper and legally sound. The certified letter that had started it all was filed away in my office, a reminder of how quickly things could escalate and how important it was to know your rights. Barbara Hartwell had learned that lesson the hard way. The Pinewood Ridge community had paid for their education in special assessments and legal fees. And I'd learned that sometimes the path of least resistance isn't actually the easiest path. That standing firm in the face of bullying and intimidation was worth the temporary discomfort. My grandfather would have handled it the same way, I thought. He taught me to be generous but not to be a pushover, to help your neighbors but to stand firm on matters of principle. The roads were his legacy in more ways than one. I finished my coffee and went inside, leaving the sunset behind. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new challenges, maybe even new conflicts. But tonight, everything was settled and right. The roads were mine, legally and properly, and everyone involved finally understood and accepted that reality. It had taken a blizzard, a threatening letter, 6 months of escalating conflict and criminal charges to get there. But we'd arrived at the correct destination. A clear legal agreement that respected property rights, ensured access for everyone who needed it, and placed responsibility where it belonged. In the end, that was all I'd ever wanted. Not gratitude, not acknowledgement, just basic respect for the law and for the property my grandfather had left me. It had been a hard fight to get that respect, but it had been worth it. Every hour spent with Tom, every dollar paid in legal fees, every moment of stress and frustration had been justified by the outcome. The roads would be there for generations, outlasting all of us. Whoever inherited them from me would have the same documentation, the same clear legal framework, the same responsibility to maintain boundaries while being reasonable. It was a legacy I could pass on with pride, knowing I defended it properly when it was challenged. As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, the story of the Pinewood Ridge Road dispute faded into local legend. People still mentioned it occasionally, usually as a cautionary tale about doing your homework before buying property or about HOA presidents who overstepped their authority. My name came up rarely, and when it did, it was usually in the context of someone who'd stood firm on principle. That suited me fine. I'd never wanted to be part of a community controversy. I just wanted to be left alone to live my life and manage my property in peace. Barbara Hartwell had disrupted that peace, and she'd paid the price. The community had learned their lessons and moved on, and I'd emerged with my property rights intact and properly documented, which was all that mattered. The roads remained private, properly maintained, and legally protected. The precedent was set, the documentation was clear, and everyone involved understood the reality of the situation. It was a good outcome, even if the path to get there had been unnecessarily difficult. And if anyone else ever sent me a threatening certified letter demanding I provide services I had no obligation to provide, I had a thick file of documents showing exactly how that would turn out. Sometimes the best defense is a clear offense, properly executed through legal channels with respect for the law and facts on your side. The blizzard that started it all was long forgotten, just another Vermont winter storm in a lifetime of storms. But the lessons it had taught about property rights and standing firm and the importance of documentation, those would last forever. My grandfather's roads were safe, properly protected, and serving their intended purpose. That was the real victory, the one that mattered beyond all the temporary drama and conflict. I kept the original threatening letter in a frame in my office, not out of spite but as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes standing firm is hard, but it's necessary. A reminder that documentation and legal clarity matter. and a reminder that bullies, even ones with the backing of an HOA, eventually face consequences when they push too far. Life was good, the roads were clear, and everything was exactly as it should be.